Good evening, everybody. Bob asked me if I wouldn't say a few words, not only of greeting, but a few words about the old times, the old days in AA, before there was any Al-Anon. But first, I want to tell you how thrilling it is again to be here. Each year seems to be better than the year before. And I hope you all have a very wonderful conference and accomplish a lot for the years and the AAs that will come in the future. As you know, AA started in Akron in 1935. But there wasn't any literature until 1939. So, in all that time, the AA story had to be taken from one AA to another. It was passed on by word of mouth. And so there was a lot of traveling about. Wherever there was anybody had a car, it was a regular accepted fact that everybody would pile into the car that could possibly get there and go to a meeting. It didn't matter where the meeting was, whether it was in the next town or where. But it was a communistic spirit in the real meaning of the communist, sharing of everything you had with the other fella. Those that had homes opened their homes to anybody that needed a place to sleep, anybody that was in AA or a prospect. So our house was continually full of drunks. We had them on the top floor, and we had them in the basement. And my father's house where we lived, he had been a doctor, and so we had them in what we call the office floor. And some of them stayed sober a while, for quite a long while, but a lot of them got drunk and did all kinds of remarkable things, very remarkable. I remember one of them got a great big carving knife and began chasing another one all around the house, down cellar and up the stairs, until a third man came around and grabbed the carving knife and took it away from it. And then there was a little fat man that lived in the basement. And he did some quite interesting things. He wanted to come in one time when he was drunk, and I wouldn't let him in. And, you know, in those old houses, they used to have a coal chute that went in from the street. And this fat man, I don't know how he ever got down the coal chute, but he slid down the coal chute. But he was quite a cleanly person, so he was always taking baths. And we had those old stationary tubs in the kitchen. And one time he got stuck. somebody had to go down and pull him out. And somebody happened to be me. Of course, we had equally sad things happening. One man committed suicide after he'd stolen a lot of our clothes. I had an evening coat then. Never have had one since. And he stole that, and Bill had a dress suit. And he stole that and took out one suitcase. But it was a marvelous experience. We learned really a tremendous amount. And we were one big family. That was one of the things about the early days, that the families were all part of this society of nameless drunks, because it didn't have any name until the book came out. I suppose they got that idea of having it in a family from the Oxford group, from which really AA, in which AA had its roots, really. Because that was a fellowship or a society, an organization for everybody and anybody. So when the AAs decided, or when the alcoholics within the Oxford group decided that they should work only with alcoholics, because it was one alcoholic talking to another one that was effective. Somebody else telling them they should stop drinking didn't do any good. It was the identification, and they needed that. But all the alcoholics' families came along too. In fact, we considered ourselves just as much part of the society as the drunks. The mothers and the children, everybody used to go to these meetings. So now that we have really two fellowships, it isn't a bit strange, really, that we have fashioned that we families in Al-Anon have fashioned our society after AA. Because, to me, it's the most wonderful and beautiful fellowship with the highest, most inspiring principles. So, I want to thank you all for showing us in Al-Anon the way. Thank you.
I spoke earlier about the great responsibility of being here, the privilege and the joy. And as all of you who have participated in this work know, it is a joy of a unique and singular quality. In this gathering, we see things never before seen in AAY. We hear the many voices of AA, and we see them blended into that harmony which is now heard around the world. Thanks for the privilege of being with you, in which Lois joins with me. Thanks, folks.
Count it for us. Good. This morning, we thought it would be rather nice if we opened the meeting by asking Lois to tell us a little bit about early Al-Anon, because so many of us weren't around when Al-Anon began, and the real hard work was done with very few, if any, conveniences. And so I'm going to turn this over now to Lois. Okay, fine. Good morning, everybody. Hi. As Patty said, we thought that maybe a little talk on the early days of Al-Anon might be interesting. So, as you all know, Al-Anon has its roots in AA. So we really have to begin way back in the beginnings of AA to really get the background for Al-Anon. And what you don't know, probably, is that AA had its roots in the Oxford group, which is now called Moral Rearmament. And the Oxford group was an evangelical society to help everybody, help the world change for the better. And they had extremely high ideals. And they didn't ever stop at helping one particular class of person. They wanted to help everybody. And Ebby, who came to Bill with the Oxford group message, belonged to that society. And so we went to the meetings. But it soon developed that alcoholics had problems that everybody didn't experience. They had something particularly unique. So they felt that, although in general these principles could be used, but the identification of one alcoholic with another was one of the main things that could help the alcoholic. Because people, for all the alcoholics' lives, had been talking down to them, telling them what they ought to do and ought to be, and this hadn't ever worked. But when another alcoholic with the same experience talked to them, they knew they understood this strange world that the alcoholic lives in. So, I was going to say AAs, but they weren't AAs then. So this small bunch of alcoholics, which Bill had worked very hard to help, decided that they better meet by themselves and not in the Oxford group, that they could be of more help to each other than just the general meetings could do for them. So they did meet together, but the whole general idea of having your wife go along and the family go along too carried over. So we all met together, and we families of early alcoholics, met with them, and really we considered ourselves AAs. I mean, we considered ourselves part of this group of people that have no name,
group of people who were trying to help themselves. So our meetings really contained the families and the children and the mothers and the friends sometimes of alcoholics. And by degrees, as AA grew, it didn't have a name, if you remember, until 1939, and that was 5 years after Bill sobered up. So in that period, it was just a bunch of nameless drunks that had no particular. And some of them thought they were still the Oxford group. In fact, out in Akron, they called themselves the Oxford group for years, even after the book was out, which gave the name to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. They called themselves the Oxford group for quite a long time in Akron, even after the book was out. But it didn't matter what name they went by. They were practicing the same principles. So the idea of the families going along with the alcoholic really had a very early start. And of course we tried to practice these principles, but only in a rather superficial way, because most of the families, I only can speak from my own experience, but I think most of them did too, they felt as if they didn't need too much spiritual development. They'd gone through this ordeal, and they felt that they knew practically all that life had to offer, and that they could handle their own affairs pretty well. But by degrees, the way I did, we had experiences that showed we could not handle our own affairs. And we saw our own mates growing spiritually and jumping way past us. We'd always thought that we were a little bit further along the road than they were. And we began to lag. And so we, in very spontily, through the groups, and I'll tell you how they started in a minute, began to recognize the fact that we had better do something about our own lives, that we had better live by these same wonderful principles. And as you've all read, I'm sure, and I've said so many times about my own experience about throwing a shoe at Bill when he said, "Now, let's get ready to go to a meeting." That's what really woke me up. Why in the dickens was I throwing a shoe? And losing my temper at such a simple remark on his part. There must be something diametrically wrong with me. Well, in those 5 years before the book came out, there wasn't any means of communication between the groups of AAs. And there were, of course, only, there were maybe 5 groups around this area. There was one one of the early ones in Greenwich, Connecticut. Did you know that, Penny? I suppose you did. One of the early AA groups was Greenwich. And East Orange in Jersey, and Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and, of course, out in Akron, and then in Cleveland, and then in Washington. Those were really the early groups for quite a number of years. And they grew, and branches, of course, evolved. But the only way that the AA message could be spread was really by word of mouth. So we used to travel about. If anybody had a car, we'd hop in it and go to Jersey or go to Philadelphia or go to Akron. Many a time we've driven all night to get out to Akron, which is quite a little ride. And whenever we went, the AAs would often meet by themselves, and that idea had sprung up during that period, too, that it was fine to have the families with them at open AA meetings. I'm going to say AA, although that wasn't the name of it then, because it's so hard to say anything else. It was nice to have the families at open meetings, but to really get down to business, they had to have at least one closed meeting a week where they could get down to work on themselves. So the AAs had those closed meetings. And sometimes, in fact, very often, we families of the early AAs would gather together, would meet. Sometimes we'd play bridge, sometimes we'd have a tea. And if we went to Washington, say, the wives would give a little tea for the coming visiting families. And we wives would always tell a little bit about how we had learned that we had to use the 12 steps of AA ourselves, or else be left way behind by our husbands. Now, Anne Smith was one of the big rocks of, well, there are only one rock of Gibraltar, but the big, well, I can't think of any simile. Maybe somebody can suggest one, but she was really a tremendous personality. Bob Smith's wife. She was not well. She was old. Even then, Bill was 15 years younger than Bob. Penny says guiding light. That's good. Very good. Thank you. She was, as I say, Bob was 15 years older than Bill, and Annie was appropriately aged, and Annie wasn't well, and she was nearly blind, and she used to sit in a corner of their living room, a dark corner because the light hurt her eyes, and smoke one cigarette after another, continuously. But Penny's word, guiding light, was really most appropriate for Annie. She was a marvelous, marvelous person. And AAs and families would come out and talk to her and get advice from Annie, and she always seemed to be able to put her finger on the trouble and to help them. And as I say, she was a tremendous personality. And whenever she traveled, although she and Bob didn't travel anywhere near as much as Bill and I did, because, well, just because they couldn't get around as easily as we were so much younger, and we could get off at a moment's notice. But she did a tremendous amount to help the families. And of course, soon after AA really took its name, Alcoholics Anonymous, and had a book, that was the important thing, had literature that it could spread, that it could spread the message. And in 41, which is only 2 years after the book came out, a wonderful article was written in the Saturday Post by Jack Alexander about Alcoholics Anonymous, and that brought in hundreds and thousands of people, and it was just a tremendous growth. And also, with them all came their families, and many of them found little groups of the wives of alcoholics in various of the places where cities and towns where AA was established, to which they could go to. Now, these little groups, some of them were what we call coffee and cake groups. They were just AA auxiliaries. The wives went along and did what came naturally, we say, to wives. They made the coffee, and they served the meals, and if they had a clubhouse, they hung the curtains, and they did all that sort of thing. Not really, or maybe only as a side issue, meeting for any spiritual growth in themselves. And there were all kinds of different groups. And later, quite a lot later, in 51, 10 years that is after the book came out, after the Sadi Post article, in 50, I guess it was, Bill traveled over the whole United States and Canada to see if he couldn't get the feeling about and inspire a feeling for starting a conference of delegates so that AA would have its structural roots in the groups. So the groups could send delegates to New York to keep an eye and to guide its services. And in doing that, he found quite a number of groups of families and wives of AAs. And when he came home, he thought that something better be done about these wives, because he noticed how different they were in character and that they had no particular form or structure or even purpose, some of them. And that we ought to have in New York some kind of a central service here that, just the way AA did, where inquiring individuals and inquiring groups could write to for information on how to get a group started, and that we should have our own steps and our own traditions and have a little bit of plan and unity, principally unity in the Al-Anon groups, that unity would be a force in itself that would be helpful. So, another man, Ann Bingham, and I started a little office work. We've heard that AA had a number of people, wives and families, inquiring if they couldn't register at the AA office. Well, the AA office was only equipped to handle alcoholics. Didn't know what to do with families of the alcoholics. So they had 87, and we couldn't believe that there were so many. So many different people had inquired. Some of them belonged to groups, and some of them were just individuals. And these 87 people had inquired at the AA office if they couldn't register their group. So Ann Bingham and I wrote to these 87 names, and we got 50 answers, which is a pretty good proportion, and 50 registered. So Al-Anon services started with the 50 groups, and we corresponded with them and did all we could. But soon the growth and the interest got so great that we couldn't handle it up in our upstairs room, up at Stepping Stones. So we moved the office to New York, to the AA clubhouse they offered us. The first clubhouse in the world was the old 24th Street Club, which was on 24th Street, on the west side. And at that clubhouse, very often we wives used to meet upstairs. And as I said before, sometimes we played bridge. But we began to have serious meetings there at that old clubhouse. So it was very appropriate place for us to open our office, which we did in 1951. And there are quite a few people here who were at that office on 24th Street. There's Margaret and Evelyn and Henrietta. Sue, I saw Sue first and I didn't, she got hidden by it. And Sue. I think those were the four that are here today that started in that office and are still going strong after these, how many, 18? No, Wanda was there soon, and Mary came some. Wanda isn't here yet, no. But they were a tremendously dedicated and wonderful bunch of volunteers that came to that office. And I think Margaret ought to tell them, Margaret, get up and tell about paper bags and things and the...
You don't hear Margaret.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The other way.
Right there, come on.
Well, Ted said when he was president of the board that he worked with a set of penny pinchers. And he looked directly at me as he said it. And it's no wonder. There was a thrashing machine that came with this offer of that second floor room. And I think Larry Mabey in AA was the only one who could get it to type a letter. So that what we used to do was Lois would call for me out in Westchester and ride me and my typewriter in, and Anne and her typewriter. And those really were the start of Al-Anon's office equipment. Lois used to save all of Bill's shirt boards because we did have 3 pieces of literature. We had One Wife's Story, which is Lois's story of throwing the shoe. It's now been revised a bit, but it's no better than it was in the beginning. We had a short piece that I think it came out of a meeting in Cleveland, and it sort of told about some families being there. It didn't really, as I remember it, make very much of a pitch for the Al-Anon program, but it did say that there was something, and at least it was another piece of paper to enclose. And then we had aims and purposes, which I've always called purposes and suggestions. But that was our literature in the very beginning. But you couldn't just stick it in an envelope or it wouldn't get there in proper shape. So that Lois would bring in these shirt boards. We'd all save envelopes and use them over again if we could. And we didn't bring in wrapping paper and string. And every once in a while, we'd run out of paper. And if that happened to be one of the days that Sue came in, she said, "Oh, don't worry, I'll get you some." Well, I've always wondered where she got it. But like Al-Anon, we'd take anything, especially then. Well, later, when we grew to have real correspondence and we had much more literature to ship, Evelyn was in charge of that division, and she used to take it to the post office, which was a terribly long, windy, cold block away, and she'd wheel it there in a market cart. We certainly had no swank about the place. And I've always thought that I attached a very appropriate name to it because it was up on the second floor and there was a slanting tin roof made galvanized iron, whatnot. But anyhow, it was hotter than the hinges in the summer. And here we would sit. It was one big room, and there was no way to get cross ventilations. And I think we did have one sort of broken down fan. But you never knew whether the fan was going or not. It didn't really do any good. And we'd all sit there with our work. I looked around one day and said, well, this is Lois's sweatshop. Because in the beginning, it didn't take long to have Al-Anon really the most important thing. But in the beginning, it was Lois's personal charm and attraction and all of the things there which kept most of us just eager for that day that we went in. And of course, it always ended with Lois looking around and saying, well, we did a good day's work. And we certainly did do a good day's work. And not little by little, but by leaps and bounds, we all got Al-Anon, which was the important thing.
Thank you, Margaret. That was a great help. But of course, this was only one day a week we first started working there. And then we had to work more and more, and then we had to get our own office. And then Henrietta was appointed the manager of our own office. And she is, well, I don't know what we'd do with her. If anything ever happened to Henrietta, I don't know what we'd do.
Oh, right on, Lois.
Because Henrietta has brought this wonderful service of ours ahead so well and so efficiently and so beautifully. And that brings us pretty nearly up to our conference. Of course, it was in 61 that we decided we had to have our own conference. We decided in 60, and it met the first year in 61. And since then, I think you all know just about all that's happened. There's nothing so, there are plenty of important things, but nothing so colorful as the early days of Al-Anon. And I hope we always remember our early beginnings, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lois. From my observations, I certainly think the higher power has brought us a long, long way since those early days and given us much to be grateful for.
The following talk was given by Bill W. at the close of the first Al-Anon World Service Conference at the Chelsea School in New York City in April of 1961. Bill's talk follows.
Thank you and welcome to the annual get-together of Al-Anon. It's very nice seeing so many of you here. It's even more of a privilege to be up here. I think we'll open in the usual way with a moment of silence followed by the Serenity Prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Bill, as you know, is here. Usually he comes in late, but it's necessary for him to get to another meeting. So without further ado, I'll give you our own Bill.
Hello, dear people. Because of my advancing age, it was suggested that I need not come tonight, the heavy duties of the General Service Conference being the reason. But I wouldn't miss this occasion for the world. even though I must shortchange you this time by getting off a little early. And the one sentence that always strikes me as I stand here at this annual rally is this: Al-Anon is the greatest thing that's happened since AA began. You know, the 12 steps are not only a way to sobriety, they are a way to life. And we drunks come into AA, and the aim is sobriety, because without it there is nothing. And we do the first step, and we do the last step, and we run madly and happily around in AA. And then we come home and we say, Mama, you'd better get a load of this. You certainly need it. So the earlier idea among the brethren, the alcoholic brethren, of Ma's getting a load of this was that Mom come down to the meetings where she could warm her hands at the blazing flame of Alcoholics Anonymous. And she could make coffee. And she could have the house full of drunks who burnt up the carpets, threw cigarettes on the floor, and stayed all night. And she could wait on stricken AAs. So that's how Ma got her load in the early days of Alcoholics Anonymous. Yet I must add that even from the earliest times, there was very naturally a deep kinship in experience and indeed in suffering between those who had been our partners. So in a way, there was a kind of an Al-Anon all along. There was this exchange of experience. There was this attempt to apply the 12 steps. There was an attempt to understand the erring boy, who indeed might still be erring even though sober. I think, though, there was a deep yearning to belong. And because of the rather exclusive nature of Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't think you folks ever felt you quite belonged. Then about 1950 or 51, there was a getting together among you folks which copied the early attempts that Lois sponsored up in the old AA club and at home, where we had meetings of getting the wives together. The same kind of a thing that Ann Smith did out in Akron. The same thing that had sporadically sprung up here and there. But we began to get requests for listings in the AA directory for groups of various names, but obviously the families and friends of AA who wished to get together and who were indeed getting together. Not so much to find out what ailed the alcoholic, that had already become very obvious, but to find out what ailed them and how the alcoholic way of life had deformed them and what they could do about these emotional dislocations, and how, if the spouse was still drinking or had sobered and was even harder to live with than when drinking, how you could relate yourself to him in a way to promote practicing these principles in all our affairs. So really, it was but a bare 10 years ago when this huge vacuum in family relations commenced to be filled. And in a way, it's nobody's fault that it was the last to be filled, because the close-in relations were the hardest, and the more distant were the easiest. It was easy enough for an active AA to be highly approved in the group and to feel perhaps a little overimportant about it. Happily, most AAs had learned to do something supremely well in business, no matter what the business was. So it wasn't too hard to get jobs and to relate yourself to the employer and bring home a paycheck. The average AA was applauded in the community for doing himself something which the grace of God had really done. So these more remote relations were the ones attended to first because they were the easier. And then there was the sort of widowhood which was imposed upon partners of drunks. The drunks knew that they had to work hard with other people. Sometimes this was carried to extremes. So Mom often felt that she was on shore, whereas AA was like a flock of ducks around on the other side of the island, where she's quite one. Now, in the good life, it's senseless to assess blame. I've had no intention of doing this. But these were the conditions that led up to the formation of what I have just declared to be the greatest thing that's happened since AA began. Moreover, you people had to take your woes without anesthetic. We drunks had the booze. So in came these inquiries to be listed in the AA directory. And by this time, the headquarters people knew that this was a sort of a touchy subject. And I remember that the 1951 or 52 AA conference was then in session. And among its proposals was one that we list these new family groups, as they were called mostly, in the directory. I think most of us in headquarters failed. And to our surprise, and not a little embarrassment, delegates rose on the floor and made impassioned speeches. No, never. They ain't going to get into this club. So the very obvious and happy solution, and the right solution, was that you form your own clubs and that you run them yourselves, and that drunks like me only be admitted by sufferance, written permits if necessary, in which you could thrash out your own trouble. Such is the backdrop against which this society took shape. And from a mere 75 groups then clamoring to register, you have now run into, how many? I always lose count, 1,500 groups. And now many of you sitting here have come from the far reaches and distant places, I dare say some overseas. And the growth of this thing, and the rapidity with which this void has been filled, has astounded and amazed us all. It is a growth faster than AA ever had in its pioneering period. So like AA, you people too have gone through the time of your childhood, Al-Anon-wise, through the time of adolescence, So now today, together with AA, and only this day, this particular day, you people have crossed a great threshold into a new future. This morning, I was admitted without ticket to the first meeting of the General Service Conference of Al-Anon. After only 10 years of life as such, why, it took the drunks nearly 20 years to make up their minds to have a conference. Now, this means that these dedicated folks here at headquarters, Lois standing for them, as in a way I've stood for AA, have carried on and have helped to unify Al-Anon, have helped to spread it. It has been a self-appointed task. But you too, like AA, have adopted a similar tradition. And one of these traditions says that the ultimate authority shall be God as you shall speak in the group conscience. And as I went down this morning and I looked at that meeting, and they had them parceled out as headquarters people and a sprinkling of delegates and a number of observers, and I saw the beginning of a welding of a family of service which might further unify AA, which would not get its authority from Lois and me, but which would get its authority and guidance from you. Now, as small as this meeting was, and considering the trepidation which the headquarters people had on its approach, I've heard it came out very well and could have predicted that. And it's the augury of far greater things to come. Now then, some of us in AA have always kind of had a notion that this program would be good for everybody. Might have a world effect. And yet we AAs have known better than to even say this very loudly. And I don't know that you people say it loudly. But please take notice of the fact that this thing has progressed from the drunk to the family to the friends, and now, praise God, to the children who got bent up, these Alateens. So that the blaze of the Spirit is greater than the blaze of AA. It is the blaze of all near and dear to them, and the world is taking increasing note. God forbid we think it our destiny to save the world, especially appointed by God. But I think this society affords a prime example who would come and see and feel of the kind of life that so many people would like to lead if they only knew about it. I've run out of my better adjectives, so I'm going to conclude this with no rhetorical flourish. I'm simply going to say, dear folks, ain't it pretty damn wonderful?